Hey, what's up, YouTube family? It's your favorite black guy from Nebraska. Yes, there's plenty of black people here in Nebraska. So check this out. I'm done with my video editor. The thing is subpar. The volume was terrible. So now I'm just gonna work off of my phone and my laptop. I'm gonna just do it like this. This is better for me, and I feel like it's better for you guys as well. You'll be able to see some of me in the background. I can see it now. But the most important thing of this is the information. That's the most important thing. Everything else it doesn't matter. So we're gonna go back to our information or our content on Marcus Garvey and the eugenicists. There's a part 1 to this book, to this piece, maybe 2 or 3 videos back. You can listen to that first part. Please check that out. This is part 2. It's like a 3-part because it's a lot of information. 2 things about this book: the indigenous nations of New Netherlands, New England, New Spain, and France, and Antilles Islands. Great book, but it's a lot of misspelling in it. A lot of misspelling, I must say. But you know what? Just because there's misspelling in here, that doesn't mean that the information is not vital. Information in this book is very vital. Once again, I'm on archive.org. So before I get off into a tangent and get into things I don't need to get into, let's go ahead and get into part 2. Let's go ahead and get this thing started. In 1973, E. David Cronin posited that Garvey's letter stress upon racial superiority probably was derived from pride in his maroon heritage, as from his humiliating experience as a full-blooded black man in the Jamaican 3-color caste system, in which the small mulatto group was afforded special privilege and influenced by the tiny white ruling class. Writing later, Winston James challenged aspects of Cronin's argument. James argued that Garvey's concern with racial purity and his radical ideology were a result of his Caribbean background. Moreover, according to James, Garvey's Caribbean upbringing also contributed to Garvey's willingness to work with white organizations. James posited that relatively low level of race consciousness combined with a comparatively high level of education attained in class consciousness made it easy for Caribbeans to work with white people in racial organizations, particularly the socialist and communist parties in the United States. In general, James contended that black Caribbeans in general were clearly not as prone to view white people with a degree of distrust and suspicion than their black American counterparts. Regardless of the foundational reasons for Garvey's cooperation with white supremacist organizations, historians have generally agreed that Garvey's outreach to such groups in 1923 to 1924 was an attempt to gain supporters at a time when the mainstream black establishment was speaking out against him. David Levering Lewis explained that if it took an understanding with the Klan to help make it possible for black people to survive and thrive separately, then Garvey was up to the challenge. Wow. Writing 20 years early, Tony Martin portrayed an even closer relationship between Garvey and white supremacists, arguing that Garvey's dealings with white supremacists represented more than just pragmatism, but instead a symbolic relationship. Garvey's belief in race purity and black reparation corresponded with white supremacist fears of miscegenation and desegregation in the United States, creating a sometimes mutually beneficial relationship, though not an all-embracing alliance. Let's go ahead and go down a little further. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. Sometimes this thing. Paradoxically, the Virginia eugenicists formed a very public alliance with Marcus Garvey, which seemed antithetical for both the Virginians and Garvey. The men found common ground in their respective preoccupation with racial purity and racial superiority, as well as their opposition to integrative policies. Moreover, the men all desired national prominence and unqualified success and implementation of their racial programs. Yet Garvey's ideology was distinct from that of the Virginia eugenicists. Garvey was not shaped by white Northern eugenicist ideals and did not employ the rhetoric of scientific racism in his assertions of racial superiority. In 1925, the Negro World sparked a controversy when an editorial linked John Powell and the Anglo-Saxon Clubs of America with Marcus Garvey, founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The official weekly publication of the UNIA, the Negro World was first published in 1918. Garvey was the first editor of Negro World, and even as others took over the editorial staff, he continued to write front-page editorials for each issue, entitled Fellowmen of the Negro Race. The Negro World, much like Garvey himself, was quite controversial for his time and was even banned by most of the British West Indies. By 1925, however, Garvey, who at the time was incarcerated at a correctional facility in Georgia, could not control the content of the weekly. Therefore, as a result of the Negro World editorial, both Powell and Garvey wrote letters of protest to the paper. These men did not refute their personal connection and reciprocal admiration, but challenged instead the editorial's assertion that Garvey and Powell, through ASCOA, had conspired in an attack on Hampton Institute. Powell's letter denied the allegations of leading a charge on the Institute, while expressing support for Garvey's Back to Africa movement. Powell told him, Marcus Garvey, that in his appeal to the soul of white America, he had profoundly touched and moved at least one white American. In return, he assured me that he and the UNIA were unalterably opposed to racial amalgamation. It has been charged that I have involved Marcus Garvey in an attack on Hampton Institute. This charge is false. In a letter I wrote him, which was carried by the Richmond papers, I stated that Garvey and the UNIA would approve all efforts towards the preservation of racial integrity. Garvey's name was mentioned in no other connection. I trust it. This letter had made 2 points clear. First, that Marcus Garvey has been guilty of no betrayal of his race or his cause. Second, that there are in Richmond, and I believe throughout the South, many sincere white friends of the Negro race who resent the injustice done to Marcus Garvey and who wish him Godspeed in his great work to build his people, a nation, and a culture of its own. Garvey's letter, while more inflammatory, echoed Powell's sentiments. Moreover, Garvey's response illustrates his discontent with his lack of control over the Negro world and his desire to maintain authority with the UNIA and its publications. I am surprised at the editorial in Negro World of today's date under caption of Marcus Garvey in White American Society, in which I am mentioned as making statements in regards to Mercer's, Cox and Powell of Richmond, VA, and their respective societies. I know nothing of the spirit of the editorial, which I regard as mischievous. I repudiate the attack upon these two friends, who have given no cause to be thus insulted. I further object to my name being used in editorial of that nature, attacking an organization or persons without my knowledge and approval. You will please reproduce this in its entirety. The policy of the organization has been defined by more than 1,000 times, and there has been absolutely no change on my part. Let's go ahead and go to the next page. Garvey's cooperation and public support of John Powell and E.S. Cox can be understood only through an examination of Garvey's background, as well as the similarities and differences between Garvey's black separatism and the Virginia eugenicist white supremacy. Garvey and the Virginia eugenicists desired national recognition, practical success, and the ability to control private choices regarding sex and marriage when they involved issue of race. At the center of all their goals was their complete devotion to what they believed was the betterment of their respective races. These similarities allowed them, as Tony Martin has noted, to form not an all-embracing alliance, but instead a practical working relationship. Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois espoused radically different strategies for the Black American community in the 1920s. Mia Bay has explained the differences in tactics of the two men as a factor of competing traditions in black thought. According to Bay, black intellectuals did not share Garvey's messianic black nationalism and instead turned to the liberal environmentalism to combat increasing scientific racism within the social sciences. Du Bois and other black intellectuals' liberal environmentalism directly challenged both Garvey and eugenicists' conviction of the primacy of biological race. Liberal environmentalism emphasized the importance of the environment rather than biological factors. In determining human capacity, in other words, these black intellectuals concentrated on improving environmental conditions rather than improving and promoting a race as inherently superior or inferior. Garvey had other critics outside the NAACP. Sorry, guys, let me go back up. Tony Martin posited that the United States was against him because they considered all black radicals subversive. European governments were against him because he was a threat to the stability of their colonies. The communists were against him because he successfully kept black workers out of their grasp. Among all this dissension, Garvey declared friendships with both the ASCOA and the Ku Klux Klan. Wow. Even before the association of the ASCOA, black American community leaders had already criticized Garvey regarding his relationship with other white supremacists. Previously, they had been criticized Garvey for attending a meeting with one of the Ku Klux Klan leaders, Edward Clark. Garvey engineered the meeting to win over Southern supporters and to discuss their similar views on Jim Crow laws, which both Garvey and Clark favored. Garvey's anti-integrationist stance contributed to the animosity with Du Bois. Both Garvey and Clark would face great criticism from the meeting from the members of their separate organizations, and as a result, the association between the two would end. Clark was expelled from the Klan while the NAACP attacked Garvey. A Philip Rudolph and Chandler Owen named him a race baiter and a race traitor. Garvey's interactions with Powell and ASCOA would be more successful for all concerned, yet still resulted in negative publicity, such as the Negro World editorial. Nevertheless, Garvey maintained a friendly and reciprocal relationship with Powell and ASCOA. Go down a little bit more so I can. On a trip to New York, Powell gave a speech to the UNIA on racial purity. To ensure its acceptance, Garvey penned a letter of introduction for John Powell by Marcus Garvey, which highlighted Garvey's appraisal of Powell and ASCOA. Members of the Anglo-Saxon clubs are honest and honorable in their desire to purify and preserve the white race, even as we are determined to purify and standardize our race. We, the two organizations, should work together for the purpose of bringing about the ideal salt, the purification of the races, their autonomous separation, and the unbridled freedom of self-development and self-expression. Those who are against this are enemies of both races and rebels against morality, nature, and God. I unhesitatingly endorse the race purity idea of Mr. Powell and his organization, and I have pleaded my moral support to their program in that direction, expecting of the honorable and honest of his race the same regard and support for ours. Garvey's sentiments were reciprocated in Powell's speech, which greatly praised Garvey's leadership, calling Garvey the great leader who has sought to do this for his race, what the greatest of white Americans sought to do for that race, and encouraged that race to do for itself none other than Abraham Lincoln. Powell pledged the support of white people in the South of this country who realized Garvey's importance. Wow. Powell was convinced of the value of Garvey's colonization movement before the two of them became publicly aligned. In fact, it was once again his wife-to-be, Louise Berlow, who helped him convince friends such as Ernest S. Cox that Garveyism, if successful, would benefit white Americans as much as it would black Americans. Garvey, at the same time, spoke publicly about white America's efforts to mandate segregation in favorable terms. Instead of stressing the inclusion of blacks in white society, he spoke about the need for both races to maintain their purity. It was the idea of the benefits of race purity and their advocacy of similar policies that allowed Garvey and Powell to find a common ground, even if their support for racial purity differed. Originally from Jamaica, Garvey was of a mixed Negro stock, so he wasn't an American, a black American. So how can you share the same sentiments of people who have been here and you're not from that same place? But I'll continue. And according to E. David Cronin, his upbringing in a three-caste system shaped his preoccupation with racial superiority. Within the system of social hierarchy based on racial background, Garvey developed a racial chauvinism that would shape his ideological convictions. Mia Bay was posited, that black chauvinism emerges in a dialectical relationship with white supremacy. Therefore, black chauvinism in 19th century, black racial thought always went hand in hand with arguments emphasizing the unity of the races. Garvey's chauvinism, although it is of a later period, can also be seen as an arising in concert with the more integrationist ideals of the NAACP within a white supremacist society. What I want to get you guys to understand is that the NAACP wasn't ran by black people. The NAACP is very much a government organization. So there's that, if it means anything to you. Garvey's conception of racial superiority and objection to race amalgamation was in a sense the reverse of Powell and ASCOA's stance on racial superiority. Although both Garvey and the Virginia eugenicists thought that race amalgamation was detrimental to the success of their respective races, Garvey saw racial mixture as fostering color-based discrimination that favored lighter-skinned black Americans at the expense of pure black Americans. Based on this understanding and his background in the Jamaican three-caste system, Garvey implicitly advocated racial system change in order to combat the color-based classes within the race. Moreover, racial mixture impeded the creation of a race type and standard. According to Garvey, the creation of this true race type would lead to black Americans achieving the highest human standard, from which they will be in any position to stop begging and praying and demand a place that no individual race or nation will be able to deny. Well, it's one thing to beg and plead, and it's another thing to consistently build a system that's constantly taking from somebody, putting them in a position for they have to beg and plead. But I don't want to get off into that without finishing this. In order to achieve this race type, Garvey urged black Americans who were off-colored to combine to reestablish the purity of their own race, rather than seek to perpetuate the abuse of both races. In other words, all elements of the Negro race should be encouraged to get together and form themselves into a healthy whole, rather than seeking to lose their identities through miscegenation and social intercourse with the white race. Garvey thought racial purity could be achieved once miscegenation ceased and the Negro race became a unified race without interracial distinctions. Virginia eugenicists, on the other hand, saw any racial mixture as an insurmountable obstacle to whiteness. Their emphasis on the one drop of blood provision in the Racial Integrity Act demonstrated that their commitment to racial definitions was based on their further strengthening the color line and on greatly limiting the definition of whiteness. Additionally, despite their assertions to the contrary, one can see in their rhetoric and preoccupation with deterioration their view that black Americans were an inferior race. The eugenicists often tried to emphasize the good qualities they saw in black Americans in order to hide the adherence to a white supremacist ideology. However, their letters illustrate their underlying racial bias. Pecker, in a letter he intended to demonstrate his racial tolerance, wrote that as much as we held and esteemed individual Negroes, this esteem was not of a character that would tolerate marriage with them. Though, as we know now to our sorrow, much illegitimate mixture occurred. The letter continued in a similar manner to assert that interracial children may inherit from their father forceful qualities, which, combined possibly with good ones found in many Negroes, enable them to attain positions of prominence in various spheres of life. In his speech before the American Public Health Association, Plecker explicitly stated his belief in Negroes' inferiority. So how do you want to make a deal with somebody who thinks you are automatically inferior? And constructed a racial hierarchy with the whites as higher and black Americans as lower. That's what happens when you make a deal with the devil. It's not going to be fair. Another foundational difference existed between Garvey and the Virginia eugenicists, as mentioned previously. Garvey differed from other black American leaders by espousing a nationalism infused with a religious imagery that spoke directly to the traditionally voiced hopes of the black masses, rather than the liberal environmentalism utilizing scientific training practiced by Du Bois and others. Similarly, Garvey also differed from the eugenicists in statistics. The Virginia eugenicists emphasized the role of science in determining matters of race and employed the terminology and reasoning of scientific racism. Religion had little place within eugenic ideology, despite the religious-like zeal of the eugenicists. Religious-like zeal of the eugenicists. The eugenicists themselves seemed ignorant of the inherent contradiction in their religious devotion to race science. Yet Garvey and the Virginian eugenicists did not dwell on these fundamental differences. Instead, they focused on their common goals and, at that time, common language. Both Garvey and the Virginia eugenicists advocated colonization, opposed social equality, and condemned miscegenation. Powell asserted his adherence to Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the letters to Thomas Dabney, noting that he believed geographically separation is the only possible means of preserving racial integrity. Plecker and Cox shared this sentiment. According to Plecker, there is only one absolute solution to the problem, advocated by Lincoln and more recently to Major Ernest S. Cox in his splendid work, White America. This solution is the gradual deportation of the Negroes. Deport people who've never been to a place they wish they're going. Amazing. Garvey decreed the attempt by the NAACP, which is a government organization ran by J people, I'm not going to say the word, to fight for social equality and claim the social equality campaign would lead ultimately to further disturbances and riots, lynchings, and mob rule and mob rule. Therefore, the agitation of the mulatto leader Dr. W. Du Bois and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in regards to social equality is dangerous to both races. Garvey did make clear that he was not arguing against racial advancement, but instead for Black American access to opportunities and environments of its own, which will point him to the fullness of his ambition. Virginia eugenicists, not surprisingly, also objected to any type of social equality, but for different reasons. In addition to their objections to the dangerous racial equality of the Hampton Institute, Plecker indicated his approval and belief in the sentiments expressed by the Committee for the Repeal of the 14th Amendment. You know, the more I read this thing, the more bad I feel for people at that time. So many movements going on and so little truth, all based on lies. People are putting their faith in these movements and they're based on lies. The leaders are lying to them. And, everywhere you went during this time, there was no truth to be found. So if you're building an organization based on everybody being from Africa when that's not the truth, how is this going to fulfill anything positive? Also, how are you going to make the deal with the devil? And how do you think that's going to turn out? So Marcus Garvey, somebody not being from America, leading people who literally are from America but are blind to who they are, desiring to lead them to a continent they've never been. Reading this made my head hurt, in a way, because it's just wow, But when you make a deal with the devil, Marcus Garvey, and that's which he was willing to deal with Satan, and his minions. And it didn't work out, and it wasn't going to work out because it was all based on lies. So that is part 2. I'm going to finish this up pretty soon. I think there's about 3 or 4 more pages full of information. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is going to be the new platform or the new template to how I'm going to do content. So if you don't like it, I'm sorry. But if you are still interested in the information because nothing else matters but the information, then hey, you're going to enjoy the rest of the content I have for you. So a faulty video editor isn't going to stop anything over here, okay? So please like, share, and subscribe. It's your favorite Black guy from Nebraska. Yes, there's plenty of Black people from Nebraska. And you have a blessed day. I'm out. Peace.